I'd like to welcome everyone to the third Mosse lecture of this year. First of all, I have to express our gratitude to our sponsors, the Mosse Foundation and the City of Vienna, as well as the Volkstheater for hosting the event. And for those interested but unable to attend the previous lectures, the weekly newspaper Falter has made a podcast of the last lecture available, and the Mosse Foundation website has video recordings of previous lectures. If you would prefer not to appear in today's recording, please inform our camerawoman, Fiona Tomasi, after the event. In our final lecture of the series in January, Josef Vogel will appear as a representative of a new type of public intellectual. He's a campaigner of the political who does not rely on his exceptional status as a thinker or on his personal authority. Instead, he advocates for a new relationship with the political resource of knowledge. Last time, Irina Sherbakova exemplified this new form of intellectualism for the context of Russia. She has dedicated her life to collecting and publishing human rights-related knowledge about the crimes of Stalinism and, more recently, Putinism. Through her NGO Memorial, she has gathered this information from Russia's briefly accessible archives and from various written, oral, and visual testimonies, which would otherwise remain hidden or lost. In our very first lecture with Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat, we started with the decline of the fourth pillar of democracy, the loss of significance and credibility of Western journalism in an age of so-called fake news, alternative facts, and disordered discourse. Research agencies, human rights activists, and journalists such as Bellingcat and today's speakers advocate for new forms of investigation and knowledge production. They seek to expose disinformation, state and corporate violence, war crimes, and genocide, to publish their findings and to make them available to the courts. The aim of this mobilization of knowledge as a counterforce is to collect, authentify, and verify diverse and scattered data in a timely manner, to circulate the resulting findings and to archive them for later use. Such an approach has been described as forensic, and this indicates that it involves tools and methods rooted in police investigations, law enforcement, or military intelligence. Therefore, the first challenge of this new practice is redefining these methods as public and democratic matters. The data used in this process is referred to as open source information. This is publicly available information that anyone can obtain by request, purchase, or observation. It can include analog documents, material traces, narrative text information, or files from archives, as well as digital data such as sensor data, machine log data, and databases. The history of open source investigations is a topic in itself and could start with the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, continue with state violence in Myanmar, Iran, and Syria, and conclude with the International Criminal Court's systematic reorientation in 2011. Crucial to its rise is, on the one hand, the so-called digital explosion, the universal spread of smartphones and sensing techniques, together with the enormous production of data on the internet and in social media. And on the other hand, the intensification of political and human rights crisis in the last 2 decades. Open source investigation is characterized by at least 3 distinctive features. First, its sources must be open and accessible to all without the need for illegal activities or special status, unlike the operations of secret services or traditional investigative journalism. Second, the production of knowledge should be transparent and traceable, enabling anyone to check and replicate a given result. And third, the public, namely volunteers and activists worldwide, should be involved in producing this knowledge. Apart from these features, certain guidelines have emerged within this alliance of civil society, activists and journalists, such as reflecting on one's own moral attitude or protecting the rights of those affected by the material. Professional, aesthetic and educational questions associated with open source investigation are no less important. How can its methods be taught to journalists? How can the results be presented using numbers, words, or images? And how can user literacy be created among the audience? These are all questions that will be addressed today. Just to give you a quick overview of tonight's program, first, Roland Innerhofer will introduce our two guests. After Gabi's presentation and Stefanos' response, we will discuss questions from the audience, and after the event, our speakers will be available at the red bar. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
Dear guests, dear colleagues, dear friends, and especially dear Gabi and Stefanos, welcome, very heartily welcome to this third Mosse lecture here in the Volkstheater. Burkhardt already told you how the program will be tonight, so I have the honor now to introduce briefly the two speakers and discussants. Gabriela Ivens is the head of open source research and part of the digital investigation lab at Human Rights Watch. You are hidden, sorry. Human Rights Watch is based in Berlin. It is a 500 persons organization that is independent and international. It investigates and exposes human rights violations. Open source is the research of publicly available data such as social media, flight tracking websites, special databases. Burkhardt also mentioned a couple of other possible sources. After getting a master in human rights from University College London, Gabi Ivens worked for Syrian Archive and led the investigative portal Exposing the Invisible at the NGO Tactical Technology Collective. She has worked within various human rights NGOs and at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. Gabriela was a Ford-Mozilla Fellow hosted at Witness, where she focused on upcoming challenges concerning authenticity of images, videos, and audio recordings, preservation of online material, and trauma reduction strategies when viewing graphic or distressing material. She researched the ethical and social implications as well as the technical challenges of this work and addressed key dilemmas with control capture technology, one of the key approaches being proposed to authenticate media. In her work for Human Rights Watch, she is focusing largely on visual documentation of human rights abuses. She locates, analyzes, and preserves publicly available information to use in human rights investigations. She works primarily with visual information, analyzing and verifying videos and photographs of human rights violations. She also reflected upon the ethics of teaching open source intelligence informations and showed us some of the limitations and challenges to be considered when offering open source intelligence informations methods at educational institutions. I would only like to mention two of her latest articles. One is Gaza, Israeli killings of Palestinians seeking food are war crimes. This is a report published in 2025. Or the second one, Time Will Tell, How Human Rights Watch Identifies Time Through Analyzing Videos. A comment published in 2024 on how Human Rights Watch documented the Palestinian armed group's October 7 assault on Israel. Now a few words about Stefanos. He is a field researcher and architectural investigator. He completed his PhD in 2020 at the Center for Research Architecture, Goldsmiths University. His PhD dissertation titled Border Natures, the Environment as Weapon at the Edges of Greece. You can find this as an open source document. This dissertation interrogates the entanglement of border and defense strategies with the natural environment at the external borders of the EU, with a focus on the Greek case. He is an associate professor at the Athens School of Fine Arts and a postdoctoral fellow at the National Hellenic Research Foundation under the project Mute, Soundscapes of Trauma. His work operates between theory, spatial practice, film, and activism that has been applied in the field and exhibited internationally. He is the co-founder and co-director of Forensic Architecture Initiative Athens. Forensic Architecture is a research agency based at Goldsmiths University of London. Forensic Architecture works in partnership with institutions across civil society, including grassroots activists, legal teams, international NGOs, and media organizations to carry out investigations with and on behalf of communities and individuals affected by human rights violations. These include violence committed by states, police force, militaries, and corporations, as well as environmental destruction. For example, Stefanos participated in the investigation of the murder of anti-fascist rapper Pavlos Fyssas, who was stabbed to death in 2013 by the Golden Dawn. He's a project coordinator at Forensic Architecture in Athens, where he oversees the agency's work on borders and migration. The group's investigations employ cutting-edge techniques in spatial and architectural analysis, open source investigation, digital modeling, and immersive technologies, as well as documentary research, situated interviews, and academic collaboration. Findings from Stefanos and Forensic Architecture's investigations have been presented in national and international courtrooms, parliamentary inquiries, and exhibitions at some of the world's leading cultural institutions and in international media, as well as in citizens' tribunals and community assemblies. So this was my short introduction, and now the stage is open for you, Gabi. The title is here of Gabi's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, hi. Good evening. Thank you so much. Thank you also, Burkhardt. I'm happy I don't have to explain what open source investigations are, so thank you so much for doing that. The reason I started working on open source investigations was because of hope that kind of regular people could flip the lens and look at crimes from states and corporations. And now I've been working in this field for maybe 10 years. I'm more maybe depressed than I was about this. And this is why I chose this topic for today, nature, because I find there's much more hope in thinking about nature and nature's clues. So this presentation and talk is going to be one of hope at what clues nature's leaving behind for us to find to document kind of human wrongs. So that's what we're going to talk about. If you feel like I'm talking fast, going through things quickly, I am, because I'm going to get through lots of different ideas. So this talk's going to be kind of part how-to guide, part just like imagining what could be useful in the future. And then I'm looking forward to talking to Stefanos about it. So yeah, I work in a team that we investigate human rights abuses around the world using satellite imagery, data, videos, really any data that can help us. And a key part of my work is normally we can't go to the places that we're documenting. Normally, what's so useful about the team I work in is you can kind of deploy us, and I live in Berlin, so you deploy us from Berlin to remotely investigate human rights abuses where we can't have access or it's just impossible to go to. And that's why looking at all the different clues that we can and looking at nature, but from a digital lens, so I can't go to places and get samples, and I can't investigate and use nature in this way, but looking at how to look at it through a digital lens. So one example of what I do is we've received a video that they asked our team to find the location, and it was the location of a mass grave in Syria. And we found the location where tens of people were killed, and it was a video shot by a perpetrator. And when Damascus was open and people were able to go, the first place our researchers went was to the mass grave that our team had found through this video. And so we'd mapped the mass grave, we documented how many people were in it, and then our team could physically go there, could document people's bones that were still on the ground, even though the massacre happened 13 years before. And this is an example of how rare it is that we can actually go to the places that we're documenting. So a woman that inspired me is Patricia Wiltshire. She's a forensic botanist, kind of plant expert that the police have used for the last 20 years in the UK. And she started in this work with a very famous case in the UK around 2 girls that were killed. And at the crime scene were some nettles, and that had been stomped down and then regrew. So in her lab, she went back and she grew these nettles, stomped them down, and then tracked how many days it took for the nettles to regrow. And she said, okay, at this certain time, so it's 13 and a half days, the nettles would have been at the same time as we found them. And they were able to then know, okay, the bodies had been there for 13 and a half days, and that helped them know how the kind of timeline of the murder. So I started to really understand her work and think, okay, what other digital traces, what traces does nature leave behind that we can use? And we use actually nature a lot in our work already, which I'll talk about. So why are we using nature? It's mainly to answer the classic questions. So where something happened, when it happened, what happened, and then who was involved. So there are going to be 3 chapters of this lecture: trees, earth, and animals. And I think Stefanos has very similar in his lecture, which we didn't compare notes about. So we have obviously very similar interests. So the first is trees. And this is an example I found in this book, which is excellent, by Susan Schlippy from Material Witness, also related to forensic architecture. And it's a case from 1999 where Slavko Dokmanovic was being charged in the ICTY for participating in a mass execution. And I promise that not all of my examples will be so focused on executions, but we'll move on, of around 200 people. And so he presented a video in court to say, as his alibi, to say I was nowhere near the location that this execution took place, and here's my video, and you can see it's timestamped kind of kilometers away from the farm going in a different direction. And so the prosecution team hired a tree expert, Paul Tabosh, to look at the tree in the video and found that by comparing a tree at one point in the video with a later point, it was the same tree, and he just turned around his car. And so he did this through looking at the branches of the tree. And in the ruling, which I was reading yesterday, he was saying that trees are perhaps more unique than people, because people are symmetrical on a central axis, and trees aren't symmetrical on any axis. So this case was from 20 years ago, and he did most of his analysis from the videos that were taken. So another example of why trees are so useful for our work, we do a lot of a process called geolocation, where you're trying to find a location through a video, through comparing satellite imagery. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's very hard. Mostly for our work, it's very hard. And none is more true than Gaza, where buildings are constantly, the environment's constantly changing. So you don't have these landmark buildings to compare because the next day they may have gone. And so what actually is always a landmark are trees. So this is from someone who geolocates a lot of videos online, highlighting how useful these trees are. And this is a video I worked on in Guinea, where this person was shot at. But if you see in the corner, there's a palm tree. And palm trees are my favorite tree to geolocate because they're so distinctive from space. So here's a satellite image of the location where this image is from. And here is a very distinctive palm tree from the fanning of the leaves. So this really helped me to find the location. So then I could match the buildings, match the road, and then this led us to be able to map the distance from the pickup truck, the tear gas canister that was deployed, and how far away he was from that, and also to authenticate what had happened, and then publish on it. So just like I found one palm tree, something we're now working more on is using machine learning. And of course, this talk had to have AI in it, and it will continue to have more on AI. So please bear with me. So then we started to think about how useful it would be to use machine learning to find palm trees for us. And we're doing this with lots of other types of landmarks, but palm trees are really distinctive from space. And if we're able to say, okay, find me a place that has 3 palm trees really close together, and then they could give us, in this area, they can return rates, they can return potential ideas if you have a higher confidence of what you're looking for. So if I'm saying, okay, give me a 90% confidence rating and return me all of the places that have 3 palm trees. So this is how we're using trees. Another example is around plants, banana tree, so still in the tree category. The FBI released a bunch of photos and videos that they asked kind of open source investigators to geolocate. And so Bellingcat was very involved in this. And this was one of the images that they asked, and it was to ask for someone that was not a suspect, that had information about a case they were working on, and all these cases involved child exploitation. So Bellingcat started to look at this image, and in the back they noticed this distinctive leaf. And so they looked at the leaf and they looked closely and they realized, okay, this is probably a banana leaf. And then they looked at all the places that had banana leaves. And they said, okay, well, banana leaves tend to grow a lot in these locations, but also near the Mediterranean. And this helped them also narrow down where they were looking. And they eventually found the location in Turkey in a resort by matching the chairs, the swimming pools, and other trees. And moving away from visual investigations, a lot of my recent work is around corporate research and supply chain investigations, so really focusing on corporate crimes. And there's this organization called the World Forest ID, and the concept is that each tree kind of has a DNA profile, and if you take samples from a tree, you can match it to where that tree ends up. So for instance, if I was transporting a tree from Malaysia in an area that has indigenous communities and it's being, there's deforestation happening, and I'm selling it to someone in France, if I buy that wood in France, I can match the trees and make a claim that it's from the same area. So this organization is creating libraries of samples, analyzing it, and then being able to say, okay, this is where these samples are from. This is their tree library. And the same is true for cotton. Recently, well, a few years ago, Bloomberg used a similar technique to show that Shein's Cotton, the big Chinese producer of fast fashion, was linked to Xinjiang, the region where lots of people are in re-education camps. So they made the ties that it was probably from this region that has a lot of forced labor. And they also did this through testing, cotton testing, because cotton also carries the same concept, which also allowed us to report on this. So that's trees. I'm going to go to Earth. And this picture, which I'll come to actually. So Earth is really useful, especially for satellite imagery analysis, to look for places where soil has changed that could lead to showing where people may have been buried. So this is Bucha in Ukraine, where atop from this, the church, these are all graves. We also reported on mass grave locations from soil perpetuation in DRC. And you can see here that we were able to report on it that spots of bare soil were seen at the location of grave sites. And others have reported, this is from Sudan, where you can see new disturbed earth. And people have started to think, okay, what's the DNA of a mass grave site, and how can you predict where mass graves might end up? One forensic anthropologist looked at all the mass graves that have been found in Guatemala, and then looked at what is the distance to roads, what's the distance to waterways, to streets, to try and work out if you can predict where people might bury people. And the project that I'm showing you now is called the Found Project, and they took this one step further. So they're working in Mexico, looking at people that have been disappeared, and they buried dead pigs due to their closeness to humans, and then monitored what happens when you bury pigs, and then how to see how the earth changes from space. So they're using machine learning to do some of this, and they're also looking at how the nature changes. So they found, for instance, that this is one of the 15 different plants that might indicate the presence of bodies. And then they work a lot with women-led collectives, the buscadoras, who also noticed that there were two trees that often grow, that often are near grave sites. One because they provide shade, and the other is because they avoid the thick roots while digging. So this is Earth. Mountains, bigger Earth, high Earth. We use mountains a lot in geolocation, so finding locations. If there's any mountain, it gives us a really good idea. On Google Earth, you can see mountains really easily. This was a trip I took, and these are just mountains nearby. And you can see that you can match the mountains this way. There's also, for those interested, this website called PeakVisor that helps you, not made for open source investigators, but a lot of our tools aren't. This is made for people, I think, that like hiking, where I could enter in a picture and it might give me back my mountain. And then the last thing around earth and sky is the sun and shadows. And this is a key part of our investigative process. We use the sun and shadows every day to tell time. So this was this morning from my hotel. And you can see the sun's rising. And there's this website that we use every day called SunCalc that allows you to know when the sun rises, when it sets, and also allows you to estimate specific time based on measuring shadows. So unfortunately, it was not very sunny today, later. It was sunny in the morning, so I couldn't get as many good shadows as I wanted. But this is what SunCalc looks like. And so I was looking at shadows on the building, but to get a good shadow profile, you need a few specific things, which is to know the location, the kind of rough date, but also have shadows that are at a right angle to you, and the object is a right angle to the camera. Otherwise, you get less reliable results. So these were no good shadows. And we call this, if it's a good moon, because you can also track the moon, and the shape of the moon, we call this, in my team, good moon. It's a good moon, or bad shadows. And also the feel of light we use a lot. So does it feel like dawn? Does it feel like dusk? So while this may look like a good shadow, actually because the angle of the shadow's away from me, it's a bad shadow. And this actually gave me an hour off the time. But pretty close. This is a good shadow. So the car is at a right angle to me, and the shadow is at a good right angle. And then I measure it this way. So I take a good measurement of the car, of the shadow, and then by entering these numbers into this website, at the bottom, 1 and 96, it gives me the time of 3:25. And when I check the metadata of that photo, which I have, it was taken at 3:29. So that's the power of a good shadow, is that if you have a human rights abuse that has a shadow and you know the location of it, you're able to have a really good idea of the time. And time is an essential component of our work. Moon, I love tracking the moon. We hardly see the moon in our work, but when we do, I always try and track it. But we can talk about the moon at the bar. So the last thing I'll say about sky is it's very interesting thinking about satellites and the pollution also that we're giving our skies with artificial light. I think, a few months ago there was nearly 8,000 Starlink satellites, and this is an image that showed 19 streaks that astronomers attributed to Starlink satellites, impacting also, we sometimes use star constellations in our work, but it's also a form of knowledge for lots of people. Okay, waves and wind. I'm going to skip this one because I think we're going to hear about waves and wind a lot coming up, but very interesting. And then the last chapter, animals. So we use animals a lot to help us identify locations, and I think there's a potential to think about animals and working with animals to predict. So this is the more of an imagination part of the lecture. So recently we used in an investigation a specific bird that's from a particular country to help us narrow down the country. It was a really important video, hardly any information, but because we were able to identify a bird, we went to a bird expert, we were able to be much more confident about the video that it was and where it was filmed. We're also animals, of course. There's this great project in the UK that's looking at analyzing hands, people's hands, because hands are in a lot of our videos where you might not see a perpetrator's face, but you may see their hands. So they're asking people to submit their hands for analysis so that they can understand what makes a hand truly unique, and maybe to use to identify individuals. which then, of course, gets us into maybe hand recognition technology, and whether we want that. And then pigeons, which is one of my favorite topics, that pigeons share a lot of the same visual systems to humans. So they did this experiment a number of years ago that they trained pigeons to detect breast cancer, radiology breast cancer images. And pigeons, I think, did a bit better than humans. This is the setup. So the pigeons were rewarded with a small bit of food if they were right, and they did really well. And so I started to think about pigeons. I did pitch it to my boss that we should train pigeons, but it didn't go further. And that's because we work with a lot of graphic content, a lot of disturbing imagery, and if there was a way to maybe think about working with animals who may be also very good at identifying content, then I thought that would be an interesting test. Just to add, pigeons have a long history. This was by a German apotheker owner who put a camera to a pigeon and then wanted Germans to use it in the First World War. And then, of course, the CIA also tried to do a similar approach that didn't go anywhere, but they tried. Surveillance for pigeons. So before I hand over, I just want to talk about this question of how forensic are these forensic techniques that we're using. And the word forensic came up before. And it's something a number of us think about in this work. And especially in looking at forensic science within the law enforcement, how much forensic science has been seen as junk science in the future. So questions around bite marks was debunked, obviously blood splatter, some questions around fingerprinting. And so when thinking about our techniques that we're using, we never use them alone. We're always using them with testimony, with other forms of data to corroborate what we're doing. Because it's quite easy to make mistakes. Also, as Roland mentioned, my background's very varied. I am not a bird expert, so we work a lot with experts. And I think a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous sometimes, so knowing when we have to consult with experts. So yeah, like the Innocent Project in the US has documented a lot of misapplied forensic science in conviction cases. So ways that I think about combating junk science is, always trying to get this ground truth. So when our colleagues went to Damascus to go to the mass grave that our team had found, from the video, everyone who lived there knew it was there. Even though we were sure that was the location, we still had that 1% doubt. And then when we started to receive the photos from our colleagues going there, that it was the location, then it offered us that form of ground truth. So we always try and ground truth. I'll work when we can. Working closely with experts and transparency, documenting what we do, our methodologies and our findings. That's why I wrote that Time Will Tell piece, to say this is how we work on time. And continue to find ways to represent uncertainty, missing data and flawed methods, which is something that I wrote about in an article with Sophie Dyer about 5 years ago, and called What Would a Feminist Open Source Investigation Look Like? And so as part of this, Soph referenced Air Wars, which is a UK-based casualty counting organization. And in terms of representing uncertainty and missing data, Air Wars has confirmed, but they also have categories like weak, where maybe it's a single source, or contested. And as Soph noted in our piece, tens of civilian deaths initially assessed as weak, was subsequently conceded by the military coalition, so UK, US, saying, yes, we did kill them. And had air wars excluded these, then they would never have been fully verified, and these deaths may have never been investigated. So that's why we always try and think of ways to talk about missing data, what we don't know, these kind of unknowns. We can talk about rigor mortis another time. Shadows are very complicated to get right. This is a bad shadow because of the road curves off. So that would have given me the wrong time. And I want to end with what's this all for? So I work in human rights, and this kind of work to hopefully make a difference in a small way for justice and accountability. And a part of my role is to think about AI and how to bring AI into our work. And I read this book recently, I was very inspired by it, and this quote is that we need all types of actual intelligence. So person, animal, plant, bug, every stone and every natural and unnatural system to push back against inequality and centralization of power and knowledge. And he said, they said you need a crab computer the size of the world at the end. So I just put a picture of anyone who's curious what a crab computer looks like. But yeah, James references it in their book. And so when I start to think about AI, I do get inspired by nature to think, what would AI look like if it was more like the World Wide Web, which is a great concept, where we're more responsive of what people need, and we're meeting people, and we're sharing resources. So this is also a James Bridle quote. What if AI were more like octopuses, more like fungi, or more like forests? So that's it.
Thank you, Gabi, so much for this wonderful presentation. Indeed, our interests overlap so densely that makes me want to apologize in advance if there is a repetition in my very brief presentation that I prepared in response to yours. So I'm here representing Forensic Architecture and Forensic Architecture Initiative Athens, a new initiative that we started together with Christina Varvia, my colleague in Athens last year. Despite what our name might suggest, forensic architecture, architecture usually referring to the built environment, we also find ourselves looking for clues in the natural environment that could help us piece together disparate fragments of evidence, videos, images, audio files, bits of testimony, in order to investigate conflicting narratives around a violent event. In fact, we spend just as much time looking at buildings as we do looking at trees. Their branch structure, the state of their foliage or bloom, their relationship to the surrounding vegetation, because we understand their vegetal matter to be a body that is rich with information, to be an indicator that could help us contextualize the events that we examine. I'm gonna play short fragments from our work as I speak. Here we see a snippet from an investigation that we undertook in 2020 to look into the killing of Muhammad al-Arab, a young Syrian man who was shot dead by the Greek border guard forces in the river border of Greece with Turkey at the river of Evros in March 2020. And indeed we use the trees and the river as points of reference to locate the incident on a map, to place Muhammad al-Arab and the border guards in space vis-a-vis the borderline, which was what was very important in this case. The borderline itself following a natural marker, the old path of the river in 1926 when the border had been demarcated. So we often look at the way trees cast shadows, their branch structure, as I mentioned, We will work with botanists to identify particular species that can be found in some places, but not others. We haven't yet worked with bird experts, but I would love to have that opportunity. Here we see photograph taken by a group of asylum seekers who crossed the Bosnia-Croatia border and were arrested by the Croatian authorities, pushed back, illegally expelled back to Bosnia through the forest. And we were asked to geolocate this photograph to see if we could verify the group's presence on Croatian soil. And I mean, there were a couple more photos that were taken inside the forest that we couldn't really work with, but this particular photo showed a meadow, an opening, as well as a tree with a very particular branch structure. There was a broken branch, there was some of the tree that was missing. So, scouring the internet, I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but I was able to find a photograph of the same tree in this snowy picture. And then a local collaborator of ours, again, ground truthing is always very important, went to that location, took a photo from the same point of view, helping us verify this particular meadow through these missing branches, essentially. Or as we did in our 4-year-long investigation into driftbacks in the Aegean Sea, we might look at the unique geologic formations in the background of an image. In this case, the ridgelines of islands, the rock crevices, the ravines, their hills, to geolocate a piece of evidence. And thank you for explaining what geolocation is and saving me that. It's not easy. Again, using Google Earth, PeakVisor, the same kind of tools that you would use, and to map the events as these unfold, place the actors, the perpetrators, and the victims in the scene. For this investigation, we repeated this process thousands of times over, verifying and archiving over 2,000 such violations, involving the expulsion of over 55,500 people in the space of 3 years in the Aegean Sea. I should mention that this is a practice that's still ongoing, but it has far exceeded our capacity to archive it and follow it, unfortunately. More often than not, this involves deploying methodologies of remote spatial analysis, 3D modeling, remote sensing, that Gabi also discussed. But we will also often look to precisely ground truth the results of this remote digital search with fieldwork. I want to show you a particular example in the island of Antikythera in the Greek seas, in the Greek waters between Crete and Peloponnese, where I went looking for traces of a group that claimed to have arrived on the shores of the island, only to be abducted and made to disappear a few minutes later by the Greek authorities. And I was looking for material evidence of their landing on the island, which I hoped I would find around that rock. The video on the left is a video that the asylum seekers themselves filmed after landing on the shore, placing them around that rock, and I went to the island looking for that rock. I had other indications, such as the rock seen in the background, so I was walking around with my phone trying to kind of match the perspective in real time and locate that rock. And indeed, when I did locate that rock, which had been sculpted by the waves in this particular shape, again like a fingerprint in many ways, surely enough, the objects, they were there. I found life jackets, I found spoons, cubes of sugar, torn documents, and the gloves worn by the police when they arrest asylum seekers at the border. And looking at trees and rocks also invites an expanded view on questions of scale, of time, violence, trace, evidence. It opens research to the longue durée of violence, and in particular of colonial violence. This is an image from our investigation into the extermination camp of Shark Island in colonial era Namibia, where we used the rocky landscape of the island to geolocate the little archival material that survived, the little material that exists, and to produce evidence of forced labor and mass extermination of Herero and Nama peoples by the German colonizers in that place. What we understand as nature as the environment, what we might describe as ecology, is not a passive backdrop against which violence unfolds, but rather it's an active component in creating harmful and hostile conditions for people. Matter is endowed with a certain agency in these violent assemblages. Nature is designed to act against bodies or against certain categories of bodies, to enact violence and to hide its traces. It's hybridized to include what we would describe as natural processes, but also to encompass technology, military planning, lawfare, and more. Essentially, it's turned into a weapon. What we see here are excerpts from situated testimony interviews that we did. By we, I mean Forensic Architecture Initiative Athens. This is our first project as FEA, with survivors of a deadly shipwreck in Lebanese waters, who describe how the waves were initially, the sea was very calm when they set off, and precisely they had chosen that date because the weather was going to be very, very soft, allowing them to travel from Lebanon all the way to Italy, and how the waves were weaponized by the Lebanese Navy to sink their boat in an otherwise very calm day. I wanted to have the sound here, but I haven't set it to work, so let's see if we can hear something from the laptop. I don't want to interrupt the presentation. Yeah, I don't think you can hear, can you? Here we see the witnesses describe how the Lebanese Navy maneuvered around their boat, essentially to stop them and eventually to sink them. This is a form of violence that is often indirect, it's insidious, it's hard to pin down to a single perpetrator. Causal relationships are here dispersed, they're diffused, they're diffracted on the body of the sea, the forest, and more. There's very rarely a smoking gun. Very rarely do we have the perpetrator and the victim in the same image and the weapon. And this makes attributing responsibility and efforts for accountability very complicated indeed. Perhaps more so than ever, violence is also directed to the environment per se, as a continuation of war with other means, with ecocidal practices being deployed to erase life worlds and life-sustaining systems as we see unfolding in Gaza, more so than elsewhere in the world. This is why today, with lives violated within wider assemblages, affecting both human and more than human lives, as researchers we need to broaden our understanding, not only of what might constitute a violent act, but also crucially, what is nature and how we position ourselves within it. How can we work with nature and within nature, not as external to it, but as one of its constituent parts, as part of a witnessing collective that will work to decode evidence as this is ingrained in its very body and to confront these hybrid forms of violence. So we need a practice that's equally hybrid and flexible, as you, Gabi, already suggested. I will leave you with an excerpt from an ongoing research and documentary project that I'm working on personally. It's called Ghost Habitats, where I use trap cameras to work with more than human witnesses, in this case roe deer, bears, and more animals that activate these cameras to conjure the erased histories of the ghost villages on the borders of Greece, Albania, and North Macedonia. For sure. Where to begin? Maybe as we were discussing before the event started, I have this lingering question that might need some time to unpack. We don't have that time, but maybe I wanted to suggest to that direction. As I said, I was rereading your wonderful text on what a feminist open source investigation might look like with Sophie. And it made me wonder whether, opening up the realm of who might and what might constitute a witness, to include natural processes, natural selves, more than human beings, whether that could be understood as a feminist gesture and kind of a displacement that's very necessary in our present condition. I don't know if I'm starting with a difficult question. I apologize about that, but that had been stuck in my head since the flight, so I wanted to kick off with that.
No, thank you. Thanks for this. I wish the deer was still here. I'll look at you. And I hope, Sophie, you don't mind, but my co-author for that paper is here, who just happens to live in Vienna. Yeah, so I feel like inviting them up here. But we wrote that paper. It was in 2020, so it's entitled "What Would a Feminist Open Source Investigation Look Like?" And I'll just speak for myself. I think that the space of open source investigation was typically very male and very focused on conflict and being fast and kind of also demonstrating your skills, and also always from afar. So typically people not from the context or working with the context that they're working on. And so we took the opportunity to riff off what would a feminist data visualization look like, which is an excellent paper and then a book to think this through. And we had a great time doing it, and it's since formed the basis of all my work, I have to say, moving forward in terms of ethics, consent, kind of the feminist principles of like enthusiastic consent. So much of our work, sorry, I know I'm going off track, but so much of our work is making decisions from afar for others. And so thinking really through consent. And then when I think about nature, then also I've started to think much more about indigenous practices and also the extractive nature of our work, of my work, and how things are on a hierarchy, I feel, and to start thinking more in a way that's interconnected, that brings in the environment, brings in all the different sources of data. And I think that's so important with with AI coming in so fast and the pressure to scale up our work. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for the environment, for knowledge? And I think with open source investigations, there's a big pressure to also have this kind of research where sometimes it's not needed. And just because it admittedly looks nice, it looks flashy sometimes. And I think coming up with the idea that it's not always needed, and there's other types of knowledge that are more valuable sometimes. But yeah, I'm interested more on how you see and how you started to think about nature.
Yeah, totally. And you're bringing up a very important issue that for sure we don't have time to tackle tonight, but consent. What does it mean to work with more than human participators in research? What does it mean to obtain consent from them? What are the ethical implications of including and folding them into that research? What does it mean to put a pigeon before a screen and make that pigeon look at horrific images of of violence? Yeah, I guess my understanding of nature as an active component in these violent processes, or as an actant, as the theorist Bruno Latour would describe, somebody with an agency within a system, came from my involvement with borders and border violence. And more we see, and that's by no means unique to the Greek borders, right? That a lot of the dirty work of the border guard is relegated to what we would normally call nature. And that's done by design. That's not done by accident. In as early as the 90s in the States, they had the very kind of clearly expressed practice of prevention through deterrence, where they would build fences in urban centers to push asylum seekers, border crossers, deep into desert terrains where they would be exposed to further harm. And we see that happening in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So I started to think, of course I was not the first to think that, following other practitioners and thinkers, how natural is nature at the border? Does it not include the Evros River that I began my presentation with? Do its waters not include, the law that renders it into a weapon, that determines the conditions under which people cross them? The fences, the technologies of surveillance that are deployed to survey those crossing it, etc., etc. So my understanding of nature is very much one where it's part of a hybrid system and not external to us, nor are we external to it. And I think that's crucial in kind of starting to draw the contours of how we would work with nature as practitioners in the fields of human rights and open source investigation, because we're within it.
I felt bad for the pigeon when I suggested it. What would that mean? But yeah, I think thinking through the ethics of working on nature would be an interesting question. My instinct was to expose pigeons to graphic content, but yeah, to think through how to bring nature in meaningfully into our work.
And on equal terms to the degree that that's possible, yeah, because you and us at Forensic Architecture, we're also looking at extractive processes, like the longer durée of violence, how an event might manifest itself kinetically in the form of a bullet, but also like in a very slow and invisible way in the form of toxic contamination. And it might indeed be the same processes that cause both kind of effects. And that's when you really need to look at the landscape to understand these latent violences, as Rob Nixon would describe them. I don't know if it's a good time to open it up to the crowd for questions, or I'm not keeping track of the clock. I'm happy to keep. I could chat with Gabi for many hours, and I'm sure we'll continue.
Yeah, are there any questions or remarks? Yeah.
I have a question. So Austria is famous for its castles, and castles, of course, have moats. They have they exploit nature. Castles in Austria have moats. They exploit nature. Greek castles, of course, have them too. 1500 BC. So what is you were talking about the longue durée. How do you see the longue durée in this regard, that we've been using, hiring nature as bodyguards, basically?
I mean, the analogy is there, right? We talk about Fortress Europe, right? So the Aegean Sea would be its moat, and the Mediterranean Sea would be one of its moats. And but behind this intention to denaturalize the border, at least in my work, lies the intention to denaturalize the deaths that it produces. So no border death is natural. It's always a product of specific policies and practices. People never die. They die at sea, but they don't die of the sea or from the sea. So like you say, it's being turned into a moat, into a graveyard, into a body that erases evidence as well. And we were discussing what possibilities there might be to look for evidence on the surface of the sea, to look at the waves, to understand the motions of vessels, and because it's a body it's in constant flux. And I'm veering off your question, but you gave me a very good starting point. Yes, it's a dynamic body, as are most natural bodies, right? Forests are dynamic as well. Our tools are mostly calibrated for the environments that we create. Cities, buildings, etc. So we need to learn how to engage with these more flexible environments as well through our tools. And I really enjoyed watching, for example, the machine learning algorithm that you trained to locate palm trees.
Yeah, I like the flexible environment because we work a bit at sea on crimes at sea. The sea is so difficult to work on because obviously you can't use shadows. You can't use anything around time. Locations are super difficult. So we purchase a lot of tracking data from boats, but most of the boats that you're working on and I'm working with more and more of don't have any tracking data that you can buy. So then you have to get super creative. So we were talking before, when Donald Trump posts pictures and videos of the Venezuelan boats that they're blowing up, what evidence can we get from that shows where those boats are, which waters are they in, where are they, which direction are they going in? And yeah, already Stefanos had some great ideas. And I think that's where what's so exciting about this work is when you can get creative and people like Donald Trump might post a video not knowing that we might be trying to investigate waves as much as we can, and then try and answer some of those questions and try to stop those kind of crimes.
Thanks very much for your talks. Just as for Nature as a Witness, do you have some projects taking into account what Rob Nixon called slow violence? I mean, the long-term violence, longue durée, as Stefanos says, that's kind of invisible. You don't know about the agency. And it's just a long-term observation, like in Gaza, for example, just before the war, when you see the soil is degraded systematically from Israeli side. So on, is this part of your research interest, apart from the border regions, which is sometimes in the mainland? Another question to Gaby, about the unknowns, so to speak, of open source information. Isn't there a kind of race between perpetrators and researchers? As soon as perpetrators notice they've been investigated, they try to do away with everything. And what does it mean for you aren't you obliged to archive everything you just come across, before it disappears? And yeah, because this is about the unknowns, future unknowns, so to speak, of your work, right?
There's a lot there. I do the second one, you do the first one. So yeah, archives, hugely important for our work, preservation. Content constantly gets removed by by the people that upload it, by the social media platforms. So we're constantly preserving, and groups like Mnemonic, who run Syrian Archive, and other archives are archiving millions of pieces of information. And then of course the question is, well, how do you find human rights violations in millions of pieces of data? Then of course you think about machine learning and other things. But the preservation piece is so important. So we work also a lot with other organizations, with social media companies, to create some kind of digital lockers where they will save the videos and content that they're removing for future investigations. So this is an area lots of also accountability bodies are investing in. And then archiving unknowns. Sorry, the second question.
About slow violence.
That's you, but there was a second part of your second question. I just wanted to.
Yeah, about those future unknowns, or future unknowns, so to speak.
Yeah.
You've got to deal with. So you should archive everything.
Well, then we have a problem finding things. So that's not our approach. And I think in terms of slow and fast, human rights work takes such a long time to see any impact. And what we're documenting, and our ethos is, Human Rights Watch is document, expose, change, and that change takes a long time. So we're constantly just trying to put pressure on, trying to investigate and document as much as we can, knowing that we're going to be doing it for the next 20 years before we see some change in some cases.
Just to add to that, it's not always that the instinctive response of the perpetrators when they are investigated is to delete, right? They might often publish more material to prove their point and say, but you are wrong, look at this video. And then they give us more ammunition, I'm sure this has happened to you as well, more material to analyze and further disprove their claims. So yes, normally there is erasure of evidence, that's the kind of impulse response, and that's how the system is designed, but sometimes there's images leaking after publication that might feed into an investigation. In terms of slow violence, and I tried to allude to that earlier, In our work, we try to address that, and indeed, violence expresses, is expressed in many scales and speeds and temporalities. One example that comes to mind very quickly is our recent work on Namibia, the colonial genocide in Namibia, and part of the demands of the indigenous communities of Nama and of Herero communities is to do with land restitution, right? Give us back the land that you took from us. But then comes the question, after the land has been emptied of its original inhabitants and the practices relating to the land have changed, the land itself has changed, and there's a phenomenon in Namibia called bush encroachment, where essentially the soil erodes and is no longer what it used to be. So a large part of our investigation had to deal with the question of how to represent this very slow kind of 100+ year environmental change through archival photography, through oral testimony, kind of inherited testimony from grandparents to children and their children and so on. And what does it mean to restitute land when the land itself is not what it was when it was taken from them? Other examples, of course, in Palestine, we see that we've investigated the ecocide that's currently unfolding, but also before October 7, we looked at how Israeli airplanes might spray herbicide along the border fence, flying on the Israeli side of the border while the wind is blowing towards Gaza. So the spraying would kill the crops inside Gaza, for example, and the evidence then would be kind of the stains created by the herbicide on the very leaves of chard. Or we've also looked at fumigations in Colombia on banana leaves, for instance, and how our evidence then is kind of imprinted on the leaf itself as if it were a photographic surface. So it's a very valid point that you're raising, and it requires a calibration of tools, always.
If I can just add, multiple militaries around the world have told their soldiers to stop posting on social media, have outlawed it, and they still post. So even though it's more widely known, it's still, the content still happens, and exactly this happened when we published on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in Gaza and their aid distribution sites. They published videos on their website to disprove our evidence, which actually led to proving our evidence. So, and then we could quote to it. So, so there's always a tension of promoting our methods and wanting to talk about what we're doing, but also in Ukraine there was an interesting piece around people in Ukraine also know that the Russian military is looking for Ukrainian content to then know where to target. And so people are also self-censoring what they're posting online because people have an advanced awareness of how their content is kind of militarized in that way. So it's also changing how people are commenting on their lived experience in that way.
Yes, please.
I have a question. Thank you so much for your whole presentation. It's really very interesting to me. And I have a question about the testimonies. So how could you, for example, you receive like whistleblowing information or videos that could be related to people because they're in social networks. How could you protect them afterwards? It's, this is something also as a journalist, how are you dealing with this? Thank you.
Important question. Our organization is based off testimony. So we collect testimony from witnesses and we go through a very detailed consent process. But normally we're not offering services to support people. So we're gathering testimony, we're explaining how we're publishing it, and then we're going back also for more consent. And then with whistleblowers, because we're much slower than news organizations, we're able to take the time with them to really invest in their experiences and other data that we can add to their work. And then, we have linked some whistleblowers to pro bono lawyers if they need that. But Human Rights Watch doesn't tend to work that much with whistleblowers, mainly because it's such a responsibility. And so I hope that we will do more in the future. But there are lots of whistleblower organizations that have been set up in the last few years that have this very high level of data protection, data security. And so, until we get to that, where we can feel we have a robust human rights approach to working with whistleblowers, we're not working with them that often. We do work with testimony, thinking about nature. I join interviews myself, and I enjoyed interview in the Yemen, Saudi Arabia border, where I then also use nature to understand people's locations. So I asked them, how long does it take you to walk to the mountains, to the border? Was it raining at the time you left? And all of that helped us to narrow down where exactly they were and the time period. So we're also starting to use those within our testimony, and not just kind of keeping open source and testimony separate, but they have to be together. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much.
More questions? I would have a question. Did you also experience failures in your research, or to pose the question also in another way, does it, if you start to do an investigation, do you already know how good are your chances to really be successful in this investigation? And then connected to this, are the methods you use for doing your research, do they influence also the areas of research, or is there some connection between that, or do you just have you just choose a certain human rights violation, and then you just look what can you do about this, or is it also going a bit the other way around, that you have your tools and then you know maybe this could be successful, or in another case maybe you say no chance?
It's question on failure is a really important question, and I love the way you address it in the text with Sophie, kind of to reveal the uncertainty in the process. So speaking for our work, of course there's moments of failure, and in fact the work that I showed, the images of the group on the Bosnian-Croatian border, it never fully materialized into an investigation, because the only image that there were images inside the forest that we couldn't do much with, except determine that they're taken in that part of the world. And the one image that we were able to geolocate, that meadow was in fact in Bosnia, was not in Croatia. And the group wanted to prove that they had been in Croatia before they were sent back to Bosnia. So we couldn't really help in that regard, because our geolocation was not, it was 500 meters from the border, so we could prove that they had approached the border, but we couldn't prove that they had been inside Croatia. So we provided this information to their lawyers, but they decided not to do much with it because it didn't help their case. And that's one of several cases. Now, in terms of how we choose the tools and the methodologies, it really has to do with the event that we are investigating, the kind of scale and speed at which it manifests, what kind of evidence we have. So there might be plenty of audiovisual evidence. Nowadays there might be cases in conflict areas where you have thousands of, your problem is that you have too much evidence, like you said before. And you have to sort through a huge amount and start verifying one by one. There's other cases, border work is one of these cases where you have zero tangible, hard evidence, so to speak, and this is kind of a binary that we also try to resist, but that's when we will work solely with human testimony. And I showed briefly a methodology that we have developed called situated testimony, where we work through 3D modeling to represent experiences of trauma, working directly with survivors of traumatic events. So we will model the spaces where they were held in, for instance, if that's a prison or a detention centers, or the landscapes that they were forced to cross, how high the waves were, how dense the forest was, how they were treated by the perpetrators. And then we will really work to to protect that testimony and amplify it and help add kind of different stages of verification to it, not to discredit it, not to replace it. And again, we try to resist this division between hard, tangible facts, evidence, images, videos, etc., and human testimony, which is understood, especially in court, as subjective, malleable. We try to bridge the two through our practice of counter-forensics. Indeed, as you said in the beginning, forensics is understood to be kind of the art of the police, right? This ritual of collection of evidence with the white uniforms and the do not cross tape and the batonets and this and that. We try to invert the gaze and request access beyond that tape through our common digital tools. And in so doing, we also try to undo these asymmetries when it comes to not only access to evidence, but what kind of evidence holds value and who can put forward the truth claim. I think I said enough.
That was, I agree totally with that end statement. And like, we have a responsibility not to raise this barrier or this bar of evidence or what's considered evidence. And there's this, thinking about forensics, there's this concept called the CSI effect, which is from the crime scene investigations show in the US, where then jurors in the US, they did lots of studies that people were expected to see forensic evidence in courts, and that they believed it, that they would believe it if it was presented to them, and they were looking for it. And so then, I can't remember who coined it, but the reverse CSI effect, whereas if you're missing that evidence, people are less likely to believe what they're seeing or what they're hearing. And when I think about my work, I don't want to contribute to, we talk a lot about borders, but a lot of borders we're talking about, they don't have cameras, people don't have phones. There's not that kind of evidence that you have, and you're having to rely on testimony or other forms of data. And I don't want to be a part of raising that bar of evidence for people to be believed. So we're always trying to strike that balance of coming up with new ways of building people's stories and to expose human rights abuses, but in a way that doesn't mean that an organization that has 10 human rights activists have to have an open source investigator on an area that they don't work on.
Are there any more questions? Well, then I would suggest that we continue the conversation at the bar, and thank you very much.